Hey everyone, welcome back to Conviction Bet. Hope you're doing well. It is a genuinely good week to be long American equities. The S&P 500 and Nasdaq hit fresh all-time highs. Today the Dow gave back about 118 points but is holding comfortably above 50,000. And Nvidia just reported earnings last week that, as usual, left analysts scrambling to revise their models upward. Q1 earnings season is wrapping up with 84% of S&P 500 companies beating estimates, which is above the 5-year average and above the 10-year average. Everyone is feeling good. And that, honestly, is the most interesting setup for what I want to talk about today. Because here's the market joke of the week. Nvidia just reported $81.6 billion in quarterly revenue, up 85% year over year, their 22nd earnings beat in the last 24 quarters. And my social media feed this week is full of people announcing enthusiastically that they've just done the math and they are only 14 months away from their FIRE number. And I just want to say gently to those people, the math is the easy part. But here's what I actually want to talk about. 31 years ago, a financial planner in Southern California published a landmark paper that changed how millions of Americans think about money. The core finding: withdraw 4% of your portfolio each year, adjust for inflation, and the money lasts at least 30 years. The FIRE community turned it into a formula. Multiply your annual spending by 25. That's your number. Hit the number. Retire. The market is telling a story about a simple, powerful rule. The real story is about what that rule cannot see. I'm J.L. Maurer, and this is Conviction Bet. We believe the stories that move your portfolio are usually quieter than the ones that move the tape. Here's where we're going. William Bengen, the man who invented the 4% rule, has already revised his own number upward to 4.7%. Morningstar, using forward-looking assumptions, puts it at 3.9. A 60-year retirement likely requires something closer to 3.2. Those three numbers tell three different stories about the same rule, and the gap between them is $15,000 per year on a $1 million portfolio. We'll also cover the single biggest financial risk in an early retirement plan that has nothing to do with the stock market. And we'll end with the version of FIRE that I think most people are actually reaching for, whether or not they know it yet. Let's get into it. The navigator problem. Before GPS, before satellite positioning, sailors used a technique called dead reckoning. The concept is simple. You know your last confirmed position, you know your heading, and you know your speed. From those three inputs, you can calculate where you are now. It works remarkably well. For a 2-day coastal voyage, a skilled navigator using dead reckoning can get remarkably close to their target. For a 6-week transatlantic crossing, a small persistent error in your compass heading compounds over time. By the time you expect to see land, you might be 200 miles off course. The formula was right. The voyage was longer than the formula was designed for. The 4% rule is dead reckoning for retirement. It is precise, it is historically grounded, and it was calibrated for a 30-year voyage. When you retire at 35 and plan to live to 90, you are on a 6-week transatlantic crossing with a map that was drawn for coastal routes. Let me give you the full picture of where the research stands right now, because it is more nuanced than most people realize. William Bengen's 1994 paper analyzed S&P 500 data going back to 1926 and found that a 50-50 stock bond portfolio could sustain 4% annual withdrawals, inflation adjusted, for at least 30 years. 4 years later, 3 professors at Trinity University confirmed the finding. The FIRE movement found it, turned it into the 25 times rule, and published it several million times. And somewhere in that journey, the caveats disappeared. Here's what has happened since. Bengen himself updated his number. In his 2025 book, A Richer Retirement, Bengen extended his historical model beyond the original stock bond mix to include additional asset classes, microcap, midcap, international stocks, and treasury bills among them. His revised worst-case safe withdrawal rate is 4.7%, And he has discussed the possibility of rates above 5% under favorable conditions. That revision is meaningfully higher. His argument, a more diversified portfolio can sustain more income without sacrificing durability. Morningstar's December 2025 State of Retirement Income Report, which is the most rigorous forward-looking analysis I know of, arrived at a different conclusion. Their base case, 3.9% for a 30-year retirement with a 90% probability of success, using a balanced portfolio holding 30 to 50% in equities. That is up from 3.7% in their prior year's report, driven by slightly improved capital market assumptions. But here is the finding most people miss. Morningstar found that higher equity allocations do not support higher withdrawal rates. The most aggressive portfolios, the 80 and 100% equity allocations that fire enthusiasts love to cite, actually supported lower starting withdrawal rates than the balanced portfolios because the volatility creates a category of risk called sequence of returns risk. More on that in a moment. The key methodological difference between Bengen and Morningstar is this. Bengen looked backward at what actually happened in history. Morningstar looks forward at what their capital market assumptions suggest is likely to happen from here, given current valuations. The Shiller cyclically adjusted price-to-earnings ratio for the S&P 500 stands at roughly 40 in May 2026, well above the long-run historical average. When equity valuations are elevated, Morningstar's model generates lower forward return expectations, which pushes the sustainable withdrawal rate down. This is not pessimism. It is arithmetic. And then there is the 60-year question. Both Bengen and Morningstar are modeling a 30-year retirement. Extended Horizon researchers, including Wade Pfau, whose retirement planning guidebook is probably the most comprehensive treatment of this topic, place safe starting withdrawal rates for 50 to 60-year retirements in the low 3% range. The exact number depends on asset allocation, success threshold, and whether you're using historical or forward-looking assumptions. But the directional truth is stable. Every additional decade of retirement meaningfully lowers the safe starting withdrawal rate. A 35-year-old using 4% is not following the rules conservatively. They are following a rule that was never designed for their situation. The gap between 4.7 and 3.2 is not small. On a $1 million portfolio, it is the difference between withdrawing $47,000 a year and $32,000. That is $15,000 less in annual income, a gap that compounds over decades and reshapes what your retirement actually looks like. If you are building your FIRE number using the conventional 25 times rule and you are planning to retire in your 30s, you may be solving for the wrong target by a very large margin. So that is the navigator problem in numbers. Now the three places the compass goes wrong. The first is retirement length already covered. A 60-year horizon is not a 30-year problem with extra time. It requires a meaningfully different withdrawal assumption from the start. The second is the one that almost no FIRE plan accounts for correctly, and it is the variable that scares me most when I look at early retirement projections. Healthcare. Fidelity publishes an annual estimate of lifetime healthcare costs for retirees. Their 2025 number, a single person retiring at 65 with Medicare with a Part D prescription plan with none of the things Medicare doesn't cover included, will spend $172,500 on healthcare over the course of their retirement. After tax. A two-person household implies roughly $345,000. Fidelity first published this estimate in 2002 at $80,000. In 23 years, the figure has more than doubled, underscoring how persistent healthcare inflation can overwhelm even a well-constructed retirement spreadsheet. And those are the numbers for someone retiring at 65. Someone with Medicare from day one. For an early retiree, the math is substantially worse. Medicare does not begin until age 65. If you retire at 45, you have a 20-year gap to bridge. The primary tool for bridging that gap is the Affordable Care Act marketplace. And the ACA marketplace took a significant structural hit on January 1st, 2026. The enhanced premium tax credits that had been in place since 2021, the credits that had made marketplace coverage genuinely affordable for early retirees, expired. They are gone. The original ACA subsidies still exist below 400% of the federal poverty level based on 2025 federal poverty guidelines. That is roughly $62,600 of modified adjusted gross income for an individual. But above that threshold, subsidy eligibility can disappear entirely under the restored hard cutoff. Cross it by a single dollar, and you can lose thousands in annual premium assistance overnight. And without any subsidy, an unsubsidized early retiree in their early 60s can face four-figure monthly silver plan premiums in many markets, $12,000, $15,000 more per year before any care is delivered. Healthcare is not a line item in the FIRE plan. It is a separate planning problem. And for early retirees, it is often the largest single financial variable in the entire model, larger than housing, larger than food, potentially larger than all other discretionary spending combined. Any plan that treats it as a footnote is missing one of the central variables. The third risk is the one that strikes me as the most underappreciated by people who are good at math: sequence of returns. And this one requires a little bit of explanation, because the concept is counterintuitive at first glance. Here is the intuitive version. When you are accumulating, the order of annual returns barely matters. You average out over time. Bad years buy you cheap shares. Good years grow the balance. The final number depends on the average, not the sequence. When you are withdrawing, the math reverses completely. If the first 5 years of retirement produce severe losses, you sell equities at their lows to cover living expenses. Those shares are permanently gone. They cannot participate in the recovery. Each year of early losses locks in permanent damage in a way that is mathematically impossible to undo by subsequent good returns. This is the mirror image of dollar cost averaging. During accumulation, you buy cheap shares in downturns. During withdrawal, you sell cheap shares in downturns. Same mechanism, opposite effect. The historical evidence on this is sobering. A historical backtest published by Bellavia examined 125 retirement cohorts going back to 1871. 9 of those cohorts, 7.2%, ran out of money before 30 years. 8 of those 9 failures, 90% of all failures in 150 years of data, occurred in a single 10-year window in the 1960s and early 1970s. Not because that era was uniquely catastrophic for equity returns, because it combined stagnant nominal equity returns with persistently high inflation, which forced retirees to withdraw larger and larger amounts just to maintain purchasing power while their portfolio stood still or fell. The single worst year to retire in recorded U.S. history, worse than 1929, worse than 2008, is 1966, over a 30-year horizon with a standard balanced portfolio. Bengen himself identified the 1966 retiree as the historical worst case. The maximum safe withdrawal rate for that cohort was 4.15%. Not because of a dramatic crash. Markets peaked in 1966, then ground lower for years, while inflation climbed from 3% to 12% at its peak in 1980. A withdrawal rate meaningfully above 4.1% would have depleted too early. Even the classic 4% rule survived that cohort, but with little margin, because inflation kept raising the withdrawal requirements while markets spent years grinding sideways. No sudden crisis. No moment of panic, just a slow compounding mismatch between what the portfolio returned and what inflation required. The 1973 to 74 bear market, where the S&P fell roughly 48% in real terms, while inflation averaged 9.3%, made the same era even more devastating for those who retired slightly later. And then there is the modern case, the 2000 retiree. Someone who retired in January 2000 stepped into the dot-com collapse, a negative 49% drawdown in the S&P 500, and then, before full recovery was possible, into the 2008 global financial crisis, which took another 57%. Two devastating bear markets in 9 years. Research from the Arca Labs shows that a retiree following a 4% inflation-adjusted withdrawal rule from a balanced portfolio would have had roughly 60% less wealth by 2010 than a comparable retiree who started in 1990. Same rule, same portfolio, different decade, entirely different outcome. This is the navigator's problem made concrete. It is not the average return that matters. It is the sequence. And the sequence, by definition, is the one thing you cannot control, which means your plan has to be built to survive it, not to assume it away. Now, let's talk about how you actually build the machine. I want to separate this into two problems because they require completely different thinking. The accumulation problem. How do you get to the number? And the withdrawal problem. How do you live off it without running out? Most FIRE content focuses on the first and glosses the second. I would argue the second is harder. On accumulation. In the early and middle accumulation years, the single most powerful variable is savings rate, not return on investment, not asset allocation, not which index fund you pick. Savings rate. At 20% savings, you need roughly 37 years to reach financial independence, assuming about a 5% real return or roughly 7% nominal before accounting for inflation. At 50%, about 17 years. At 70%, roughly 9 years. The math accelerates steeply once you cross 50%, which is why so much FIRE content focuses on spending reduction. It is genuinely the most powerful lever available. The important caveat, and I want to say this plainly, a 2025 Manulife John Hancock Financial Resilience Report found that 75% of people who retired earlier than planned wish they had saved more. Early retirees also reported higher financial stress than those who retired on schedule. That finding is interesting not because it tells you to save more or less, it tells you to take seriously the possibility that you may not control when your working life ends. Nearly half of all retirements in the United States are involuntary. Job loss, health events, caregiving responsibilities. The person who builds financial independence has options when those moments arrive. The person who doesn't has a crisis. Build the plan that accounts for both possibilities. On the mechanics of accumulation, the American tax code contains what amounts to a government subsidy for long-term savers, and most people use it incompletely. For 2026, the contribution limits are as follows. The 401k limit is $24,500 per year. Ages 60 to 63 get a super catch-up contribution of $11,250 additional dollars. That is a provision from the Secure 2.0 Act, and it is new and underused. The Roth IRA limit is $7,500. The health savings account limit is $4,400 for an individual, $8,750 for a family. Most people know about the 401k and the IRA. Far fewer people use the HSA the way it was designed to be used. The HSA has what I think of as a triple tax advantage. Contributions are pre-tax, growth is tax-free, and qualified medical withdrawals are tax-free. After age 65, non-medical withdrawals are allowed without the 20% penalty, but they are taxed as ordinary income exactly like traditional IRA distributions. For a long horizon early retiree facing a $172,000 lifetime healthcare liability, the HSA is arguably the most structurally advantaged account in the entire tax code. A powerful strategy, when cash flow allows, is to contribute the maximum, invest the balance aggressively, and pay current medical expenses out of pocket, leaving the HSA to compound for the healthcare costs that await. For many eligible early retirement savers, a reasonable default waterfall flows in this order. 401k up to the employer match, that is literally free money. You take it first, then HSA maximum, then Roth IRA maximum, then additional 401k contributions, then taxable brokerage. That order works well for a lot of people, but the right sequence depends on your specific situation. HDHP eligibility, tax bracket, and Roth versus traditional trade-offs all matter. And then there is the Roth conversion ladder, the mechanism that allows early retirees to access pre-tax retirement funds before age 59 and a half without paying the 10% early withdrawal penalty. The mechanics. You convert traditional IRA funds to Roth IRA each year during early retirement. Then withdraw the converted principal, not earnings, after each conversion's 5-year clock has run. Done correctly, by managing your taxable income strategically across years, you can access the bulk of your retirement portfolio well before traditional retirement age, pay taxes at historically low marginal rates, and maintain ACA subsidy eligibility simultaneously. Done incorrectly with a large conversion that spikes your modified adjusted gross income above $62,600 for a single person, you can lose thousands in annual premium assistance for a marginal tax benefit. The interaction between the Roth ladder and the ACA subsidy cliff is the most complex piece of personal finance that most early retirees will ever manage. Manage it carefully. Now, the withdrawal machine, and this is where the dead reckoning metaphor comes back. The original 4% rule is a static rule. Set the initial withdrawal at 4% of the starting portfolio. Adjust for inflation each year. Never deviate. It is the navigator who sets a heading on day one and never looks at the stars again. It works beautifully in calm waters. It fails when conditions change, and the plan has no mechanism for recognizing that. The research alternative is dynamic withdrawal, and this is what Morningstar's 2025 report explores at length. The most formalized version is called the guardrails approach, originally developed by financial planners Jonathan Guyton and William Klinger. The idea, you establish an upper and lower guardrail for your withdrawal rate. When the portfolio performs well, you give yourself a raise. When it underperforms, you cut spending temporarily, modestly, and by a predetermined amount. You are not flying blind. You are taking a star sighting at regular intervals and adjusting your heading. What does that buy you? Morningstar's 2025 analysis found that a guardrail strategy applied to a 40% equity, 60% bond portfolio supported a starting withdrawal rate of 5.2% under one specific configuration. They tested compared to 3.9% under a rigid fixed withdrawal approach. The trade-off is spending variability in down markets. You spend less. For a retiree whose fixed expenses are covered by Social Security or other guaranteed income, that trade-off is often worth taking. For a retiree who has retired at 40 and has no Social Security for 25 years, the spending variability is something to model carefully before committing to it. And Social Security deserves a direct mention here because it is the variable most FIRE plans treat as a footnote, and it is anything but. An early retiree may still qualify for Social Security benefits, but leaving the workforce at 35 or 40 can leave zeros or lower earning years in the 35-year benefit formula, meaningfully reducing the eventual monthly benefits. Morningstar's own research found that delaying Social Security to age 70 is one of the highest return decisions available to a retiree with a long horizon, but bridging from early retirement to age 70 requires the portfolio to carry the full income load for decades before that guaranteed income kicks in. That raises the early withdrawal burden, tightens the sequence of returns window, and interacts directly with the ACA subsidy cliff. If you are modeling an early retirement plan and Social Security is not in the model is incomplete. The structural implementation that I think works best for most people, particularly early retirees, is the bucket strategy. The concept was pioneered by financial planner Harold Evensky and has been extensively popularized by Morningstar's Christine Benz. The idea is simple. You divide your portfolio into 3 pools organized by time horizon. The short-term bucket holds 1 to 3 years of living expenses in high-yield savings accounts, money market funds, and short-term treasuries. The medium-term bucket holds 4 to 10 years of spending in intermediate treasuries, a TIPS ladder, and investment-grade bonds. The long-term bucket holds everything else: equity index funds, international exposure, real estate investment trusts with a horizon of 10 years or longer. The logic is defensive. When the market collapses, and at some point you are not selling equities to pay your grocery bill. You are drawing from the short-term bucket, which was never in equities to begin with. The long-term bucket has years, possibly a decade, to recover before you need to touch it. This is one structural answer to sequence of returns risk. You cannot prevent a bad market decade. You can engineer your portfolio so that a bad market decade does not force you to sell equities at the worst possible time. That is the difference between a plan that survives the 1966 retirees decade and one that does not. The bucket strategy also pairs naturally with the ACA management problem I mentioned earlier. In years when you need to stay below the subsidy cliff, you pull from the short-term bucket and carefully metered Roth conversion principal sources that don't automatically push your Maggie above the threshold. In years when income management is less critical, a spouse has employer coverage, you've crossed into Medicare, you've done a large Roth conversion in a strategic year, you refill the short-term bucket from the medium or long-term bucket. These are not separate problems. They are the same problem. And the bucket structure gives you the visibility to manage both simultaneously. Let's bring this back to what it means for an investor. Pause. The goal of everything I just described, the correct withdrawal rate, the right account structure, the bucket strategy, the guardrails, is not to maximize return. It is to survive the fragile decade, the 5 years before and 5 years after your retirement date, when sequence of returns risk is at its peak, when any sustained portfolio damage becomes permanent, when every withdrawal decision carries consequences for the next 30 years. Get through the fragile decade without forced equity sales or irreversible portfolio damage, and the long-term bucket has time to do its job. Stumble in the fragile decade, and no subsequent bull market fully fixes it. Now, the bear case, and I want to state this fairly because I think it is actually a serious one. The bear case on FIRE planning, not on financial independence, but on the rigid version of it, is this: that the entire framework is built on a set of assumptions that may not hold, that the safe withdrawal rate is based on a century of U.S. market data that represents perhaps the most favorable equity environment in global economic history, that U.S. markets returning 7% real annually in the long run is not a law of nature. It is one data point from one country in one era. A Japanese investor applying the same framework in 1990 would have found a very different answer. That forward-looking return expectations at current valuations are meaningfully lower, that healthcare costs will continue to grow faster than general inflation, that ACA policy will remain uncertain, and that a plan built around precise mathematical targets is inherently fragile in a world where the inputs are probabilistic and the horizon is 60 years. That is a legitimate concern. I hold it myself to some degree. Here is why the framework survives it. Morningstar's forward-looking model already accounts for elevated valuations. That is why their number is 3.9, not 4.7. The guardrails and bucket strategy are explicitly designed to absorb shocks the static model cannot anticipate. The HSA, the Roth ladder, and the ACA cliff management directly address the healthcare uncertainty the simple formula ignores. The bear case is not an argument against FIRE planning. It is an argument against the outdated version, the one where you multiply by 25, hit the number, and assume the rest handles itself. A sophisticated version of FIRE planning should be built around the bear case. It uses lower withdrawal rates, dynamic adjustment mechanisms, sequence buckets, and healthcare buffers precisely because the bear case is real and the future is uncertain. And this brings me to the part of the story that I think most FIRE guides miss entirely. FIRE is not a switch. It is a spectrum. And the most useful version of it does not require you to cross a magic number before your life gets better. Consider what researchers call barista FIRE. You accumulate somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million, and then you take a part-time job specifically, one that provides employer health coverage. Starbucks, for example, offers full medical, dental, and vision benefits to employees who accumulate 240 hours over 3 consecutive months, averaging roughly 20 hours per week. Costco has similar programs. For an early retiree facing $12,000 to $22,000 per year in ACA marketplace premiums, an employer healthcare plan from a part-time job is not a consolation prize. It is a direct structural solution to the largest single risk in the early retirement plan. It converts the hardest problem into a solved problem with 15 to 20 hours of work per week. Coast Fire is even more interesting to me intellectually. The concept, accumulate enough early enough that compound growth will carry your portfolio to a full retirement target by age 65 without any additional contributions. You stop trying to build the nest egg. You just need to earn enough to cover current expenses. At a 7% real return, a 35-year-old who wants to reach $1.5 million by 65 needs approximately $195,000 in their portfolio today. At a more conservative 5% real return, that rises to $347,000. The return assumption matters enormously, which is the point. But at either number, Coast Fire is potentially reachable in your early 30s. And once you've reached it, the financial pressure to optimize every dollar, maximize every account, and sacrifice current experience for future security is gone. You just need to cover this year. Time does the rest. What unites both of these, and what I think is the actual value proposition the FIRE movement has always been pointing toward, even when it has not named it correctly, is optionality. The ability to make choices that are not dictated by financial necessity. The ability to decline a toxic situation, take an unpaid leave, pursue something that matters but does not pay well, or weather an unexpected disruption without a crisis. Jim Collins, in The Simple Path to Wealth, called this FU money, the fund that gives you choices even before it gives you retirement. It does not require 25 times your annual spending. It requires enough to change the negotiating position, enough to have options when the options matter. Available survey data consistently shows that truly early retirement remains rare. Less than 2% of Americans retire in their early 40s, somewhere around 6% by their early 50s. And yet surveys consistently find that a far larger share of Americans say they would like to retire early. One poll put it at roughly a quarter of the working population. The gap between those two numbers is wide. But the relevant question is not how many people cross the finish line of full, permanent, never work again retirements. The relevant question is how many people build enough financial foundation that the moments when work becomes genuinely untenable, and those moments come for almost everyone, do not become catastrophes. The 25 times rule gets you to a number. The dead reckoning navigator gets you close for a short enough voyage. But the investor who survives 60 years of retirement is the one who built a plan that could take a star sighting, adjust the heading, cut the spending, rebuild the short-term bucket, manage the magi, and keep sailing without the certainty that the weather would cooperate. The goal was never to stop working. It was to stop having to, and those are not the same problem. Anyway, that's this week. If you prefer to read, the show has a Substack called Quiet Velocity. Find it at quietvelocity1.substack.com. That's quietvelocity1.substack.com. And if you're enjoying Conviction Bet, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, whatever you use. Leave a review if you have 30 seconds. It genuinely helps new listeners find the show. Until next time, stay patient, stay skeptical, and keep your eye on the quiet stuff. I'm J.L. Maurer. This has been Conviction Bet.